Quake 3 Arena is a momentously important game. This is something that most people recognize, but primarily for its gameplay and its technical achievements. For its time, it was probably the best game engine ever made, although you can always go between Unreal and id Tech and Unreal Tournament and Quake and argue about which one is better. However, I certainly have my allegiances. I think Quake 3 is the greatest arena shooter ever made. That being said, when we laud Quake 3, we usually do it for those technical reasons or the gameplay I mentioned. For example, it had an amazing competitive scene, one of the largest competitive scenes for early gaming, period. It brought together all kinds of professional players from Quake 1 and 2 like Machiavelli or Thresh into one big arena alongside new names, and it would make lots of household names in competitive gaming for a long time like Cooler, Cypher, Avec, and so on. Although, by the 2010s, Counter-Strike had basically completely usurped Quake altogether. That being said, we don't talk much about the level design and architecture in the aesthetic sense in Quake 3. The design of the maps, the art, the textures, all of that. I think there's a lot to say there because it's a very visually noisy and interesting game with a lot of different styles and themes going on at the same time. Despite the many intrinsic virtues and qualities of interest about Quake 3's maps and visual design, there's also something I think in the historical context which makes it particularly suitable for Halloween. There's a haunting quality to these maps. They used to be full of life. People would make friends here, play with friends they already had, make enemies, turn friends into enemies, all that sort of thing. And they also took it pretty seriously too. It was a hardcore gamers game. Not to mention the competitive players who literally staked large parts of their life on this game. That being said, now it's kind of like this Ozymandian reminder of something which once was, the way all great games, big and small, will eventually fade into obscurity. For a competitive multiplayer game like Quake, it's especially stark. It was a huge phenomenon, and now it's more or less just a memory, something you can harken back to. And although many people harken back to arena shooters when they're comparing them favorably to modern games, very few people actually go and play them. The number of people complaining about modern games is on the whole much, much larger than the number of people playing older games. Or even trying to, for that matter. Setting my curmudgeonly complaints aside, I do think it's an interesting intersection. The Quake 3 maps were these dissociative, strange voids linked by all kinds of garish and over-the-top aesthetics, the demonic, the abstract, locked in a void, with no connection to anything outside of itself. And now they have fulfilled their promise and become empty, barren graves. All you can sense here is that at one point in time these levels were very important to many people. It makes it worth inspecting them in my opinion, especially when they also have such interesting and distinct visual designs. Quake 3's visual design is not really succeeded by any of its successors. Although its technical innovations and its gameplay inspired many arena shooters afterwards, and to a certain degree, parts of it even inspired games like Counter-Strike, although less so, mostly through Quake 1's influence, it still makes the levels worth looking at in my opinion. Something is here that never really got through to any of the future games you see coming after Quake 3. And in my opinion, there's still nothing I can think of which is quite like Quake 3 at all. The dissociative character of Quake 3's aesthetic direction is, in my opinion, subtle, very strong. Not just in the grayed out, dull, void environments you might see on the Longest Yard and its ilk, but also even in the phantasmagoric settings. The entire thing is a strange mixture, something like a dream, something which could only be held together by an element of dissociation from itself. Of course, to put it in less pretentious language, I think that the aesthetic direction is very strong despite the strange mishmash of elements. Everything in Quake 3 Arena has this sort of hallucinatory quality. You could imagine continuing things out and adding more details, but you can't imagine that there's any kind of logical connection between the places depicted in some kind of coherent outside world with a logic we could recognize as relevant to daily living. You know, there's simply no way to get from the Longest Yard to a 7-Eleven or something like that. Whereas a cityscape map in another first-person shooter game of the time, you could totally imagine such a connection. Even if it's a science fiction space station, System Shock 2 or things like that, you can still imagine connections back to things we could recognize in our daily lives. Quake 3 Arena is a series of strange places, disconnected from any kind of human life, but I find it all the more interesting that they still are able to have such a strong sense of identity despite being displaced atoms, separated from each other and anything we would recognize. More or less, then, I want to go over a few of my favorite Quake 3 levels, well, some of my favorites, and some are included because I think it's relevant for depicting the stylistic and aesthetic breadth the game has to offer. Overall, I think that we have forgotten a lot of things that Quake 3 maybe knew better. Things like, you don't always need to tie your worlds together with a bunch of diegetic glue, and you're not exactly just doing less by doing that, you're depicting something different. To me, it's not that the Quake 3 Arena levels aren't well enough fleshed out, it's just that they're fleshed out in a very different way. They certainly have a lot of stylistic implications for things that could happen there or what their purpose is, and descriptions, the characters you find on them in the campaign, things like that. Someone could tell me that, well, this isn't exactly a very important part of Quake 3, the descriptions and campaign and all that. But you must admit that the artist spent a lot of time making this stuff, and I'm really more interested in talking about the art per se than Quake 3 entirely as a game, which is a totally different discussion. Of course, I was a big player of a lot of arena shooters, but it's just not relevant to the point of this video. That being said, let's get into the first level I want to cover, which is going to be Q3 Tourney 1. Quake 3 maps are usually referred to by their console name, or the name they have in the files. So for example, the map I'm going to discuss right now is called Q3 Tourney 1, the first tournament style map, you see. Whereas in the Quake 3 campaign, most levels are designed to be open arenas in a deathmatch format, like a free-for-all basically. The tourney maps are designed to be 1v1 challenges against the most difficult bot in the tier. See, the campaign proceeds in tiers. But despite these being called Q3 Tourney 1 or whatnot most of the time, they do have second names which are used in the campaign. Descriptions, more or less. This one, for example, is called Power Station 0218, Q3 Tourney 1. This is the first tournament style level, the first duel you'll have in the game. You fight Sarge, who's this very gruff looking badass military guy from a futuristic military of nondescript capacities or time period or basically anything. Sarge actually appears in the opening cinematic for Quake 3 Arena, where he defends off an army before being transported to the arena, where he will, I suppose, fight for some amorphous overlord's amusement. This level is the first in a series of levels which is technologically baroque, complicated, high sci-fi, and also a little dark. A little bit like Warhammer 40k, but more cartoony, less structured, less worldly, less coherent. Something like a fever dream someone might have after playing a game of Warhammer 40k more than anything else, also mixed in with other kinds of science fiction. So for example, there is this very complicated wiring and piping leading up to Tesla tubes, some sort of electric ball being constructed. I suppose that's supposed to be like a generator of some kind, since it is a power station. But of course it all makes very little sense, leading up from lava. I guess the lava is where the energy is coming from. But that's besides the point of Quake 3 Arena. The point, which is what makes it so interesting, is simply to look fascinating, cool, and otherwise captivating. To be a good arena. First and foremost, every level is designed to be an arena, not to be a place. However, it's not to say that they're uninteresting. In my opinion, the fact that they are such backdrops in their own right, in the sense of the setting is not important, makes it all the more, how would one say, I guess, there's an uncanny feeling when you fixate on the environments and you really give them your eye. They weren't trying to be looked at in that much detail, so it's a little bit like when you see an optical illusion. Lots of interesting textures, bricks glued together, pasted together. Seems quite lo-fi for such a science fiction hi-fi environment. Something that almost looks like tin metal sheets. I don't know. I mentioned pylons, and you saw one on screen. There are actually two in the map. One has these very strange chains all over it, as if it were imprisoning something or anchoring it down. Makes you think maybe this is on some kind of magmatic planet. You can see the stars through the roof, but it doesn't really make sense to anchor this thing down unless there was a large amount of force. Maybe it's like a floating island extracting energy from lava below. Despite that, though, there is of course very little attempt to make this into some kind of sensible power station. No inspiration was presumably taken from real power stations, and the justification would presumably be that the technology is simply so advanced that it bears little resemblance to modern day techniques. I talked earlier a little bit about the spiritualism in the lady, but I think it's worth mentioning more. Of course, on the doorways there are these demonic horns, things like that, and of course this lady sticks out of the map. Something like a mermaid on a pirate ship. She looks down and provides this radiant light. I'm sure it was a very stunning effect for the time. That being said, it's part of a recurring theme in Quake 3 of some strange spiritualism, usually demon-related, influenced by the satanic imagery of bands in the 90s and 80s, I'm sure. And of course, there is the beautiful moon in the skybox. Static, unmoving, low resolution. Only a couple pixels on the sky, but it's quite striking. In the room, there's more demonic imagery. I find it quite interesting, the skyboxes in Quake 3 Arena. Basically, many maps have these open areas where you can look up and see the sky, and it's interesting. For maps which are so closed off in terms of their topology, no entrances or exits shown anywhere on the map actually, there's always something visible, something from the outside world, in the sky. The skyboxes are one of my favorite parts of Quake 3 Arena. They add some nuance to what would otherwise be a Quake 1 style lockbox. The texture work in Quake 3 is also quite interesting. I mentioned earlier how some of the material here is just this brick looking stuff, presumably super fancy cyber steel something brick. But of course there's also this very strange organic looking texture. I don't know what this is. Maybe it's some kind of alien material, something or other, but it looks a little organic, like it has prints all over it akin to what you'd see on leaves or natural life in that way. It certainly doesn't look like something which has been machined out or pressed. It looks more like the grainy interior of wood, or like something you'd see out of Doom where demonic ooze has spread all over materials. The lighting must have been something for its time. There's some dynamic lighting on these big pylons, purple light. Very colorful and cool effect. These days you're less likely to see such colors on maps because it's physically uncommon to have purple light radiating from things. Still, I find this map very beautiful. I think it's very interesting. It's a closed off little box which encapsulates a lot of Quake 3's level design tropes and motifs visually. The next level I'd like to talk about is Grim Dungeons. As you can imagine, this level is a little bit of a change up from the hyper-technological theme of the last level. Grim Dungeons is not quite full into the demon stuff, but it's getting there. I would say that the big poles of influence in Quake 3 Arena are demonic stuff like Doom 2, technological stuff, all cybernetic and whatnot, kind of like Doom 2, but a little different, a little more dissociated. After all, there's a lot of influence still lingering from Quake 1 that inflects the technological stuff towards something which is a little more Trent Reznor coded, a little more Nine Inch Nails, a little less Megadeth and Metallica, as one great reviewer on Quake once said, Errant Signal. Anyway, Grim Dungeons is definitely closer towards the demon stuff, but there's kind of a third pole with Quake, which you saw in the first Quake game, and I think it comes out very clearly in Quake 3 Arena, although it's one which is a little more subtle, which is that sort of rustic kingdoms and fantasy theme. It's not as obvious in Quake 3 Arena because it's easy for it to blend into all the satanic demon stuff, but it's definitely there, and I think you see it a lot in this level. Something like a strange hidden castle dungeon It's very much so not straightforwardly demon worshiper stuff or straight out of hell or something like that. It's not red at all. There's no lava. But it is very much so tinged with fire and brimstone. Just a little bit. Of course, the elephant in the room for me is the beautiful skybox. I simply must talk about it. The skybox on this level is beautiful. Yellowy, orange, looks like something out of a dust storm. It's something you just don't see in the real world, and it's so beautiful. Unless maybe you live in a desert. Then again, I wouldn't know. I've never been there myself, so I can't say what it would look like, but whatever this is, I love it. It does kind of remind me of those dust storms you saw moving over the US a while back. Whatever it is, I love it. It's beautiful. I know I keep saying that, but it's just true, and it complements the colors of this level so well. I think it's fascinating how much harmony of color and picture plays a part in these levels, although they don't have a coherent structure insofar as stuff like what is the world about, or why is this place situated here, where are the entrances and exits. It does have coherence visually. The colors and visuals are harmonious. For example, this dusty yellow-orange sky really suits the orange brick palette of this level very well. Of course, there's that sense of lacking greater place which is present in basically all Quake 3 levels, in the sense that it's hard to imagine where this place could possibly be, or what purpose it could serve. However, that does not get in the way of the enjoyment for me at all. On the contrary, it adds to it. It's like some strange, beautiful dreamscape, lost in a yellow haze. Although Quake 3 has very little interest in placing its places, in the sense of giving them broader context, it seems to never lose interest in showing you its skyboxes, which one would assume are ways of giving contextual reference to where a location is. After all, largely a skybox gives you a view of the broader geometry outside of a place, or if not geometry, at least visual landscape. Yet in some strange way, the skyboxes in Quake 3 rarely do that. They serve more as mood pieces or tonal reminders, or tone setters. Just there for ambience, really. But you can see them all over the place. There are these little windows laid out which show you views of the skybox even from inside the hallways of its maze-like levels. Despite what I said about this place not being too full of demon stuff, it definitely has its fair share. Down here in the basement, which is more labyrinthian, you can see all kinds of strange demonic things. Walls peel and give way to fleshy growths, and you can see what appear to be serpent fangs sticking out of the walls. Of course, no discussion of this level would be complete without mentioning the Jesus statue. Usually, the statues or symbolism are rather demonic. Yet this one is Christ on the cross wearing his crown of thorns. Although the cross is invisible, he's just sticking out of the wall. Another hell chamber. The most hellish chamber in grim dungeons. One can only assume that it was some kind of torture dungeon. You stuff people in there and there's demons down below which torture them. Maybe they even have Christ stuck down there, considering the statue. You'll notice this red fog effect show up a lot, especially in hellish area or demonic ones. One can only presume it leads to the very bowels of hell itself. There's definitely still a lot of what you would call technological stuff in the visual design here. You can see in these walls there's all sorts of circuit boards and electronic stuff. Doing what? Who knows? And the door itself is also some mixture of strange demon stuff and technology. It automatically opens when you get close. I guess that's what all these electrical what-have-yous are for, opening doors. As a final note, it's worth saying, I think, that this level has a sort of structure which many Quake 3 levels do, where there are essentially two types of look or theme or feels going on, and the level is separated into two parts. The lower half in this one, the interior of the dungeon, contains hellish and strange things, Christ on the wall, the demonic imagery. The top half is more castle-like. More like something out of a kingdom or a medieval fantasy game, although still laden with small technological trifles and demonic imagery. For example, the gargoyle. That being said, it's actually one of my favorite levels visually. The yellow center, in terms of the color harmony, in my opinion, is quite beautiful and quite striking, and the skybox is unforgettable. DM15 is definitely more straightforwardly hellish. Something straight out of Doom 1. Well, although less technological in many ways than in that game. Setting that aside, it's extremely red, which is the most outstanding thing about most of the high hell areas. Red, red, red. A red skybox, which is constantly moving, similar to the skybox on DM14. But of course, whereas that one was a mild temperamental yellow, this one is straightforwardly red, depicting what it must be like in the guts of hell. The arena itself is kind of like this cathedral or castle-like structure. It also has a highly vertical layout, similar to DM14. Of course, it's a highly demonic area, all kinds of pentagrams and stuff like that scatter all over the place. And there's literal lava, because you're in hell, in case you ever forgot. There are also some tight passageways. One of the things you'll see a lot in Quake 3 arenas, there's a very high diversity in the types of geometry and areas you can find. Tight passageways, large open areas. Myself, I'm quite partial to the open areas, but I can see what people enjoy about these claustrophobic places, I guess. The base game of Quake 3 loves jump pads. In these levels, this is a popular free-for-all map, you get a lot of different jump pads all over the place. I like jump pads. I'm not going to get into it too much because it's sort of a gameplay thing. And although I like them, I don't like them that much. They slow down the movement of the game a lot, and they also make you a giant, easy-to-hit target. That being said, it's not really something to factor in when you're talking about the visual design of the levels, but it does mean that the effective topology of how you navigate them is quite different. Although, for example, the large central room may look open, it's actually something like a messed up spaghetti, because people are always going to be braiding themselves between these little holes in the walls, coming out either side and going through a jump pad. Talk about a demonic set piece. There are literally upside down crosses swinging across the area with the quad damage. If you get hit, you get knocked off and fall into the pits of hell. Full of more red smoky stuff as usual. I guess demons really are popular with arena purchasers. Of course, there's this couple scantily placed windows in this level. This one isn't pointing at the level, just the skybox, which I think is interesting because it gives you a different feeling for the level. Whereas in the large open courtyard, it feels more like a sort of, open wide place in a pit of lava. Looking out this claustrophobic little window makes it feel once again like you are in a disembodied void. I tend to believe that almost everything about a Quake 3 level's visual motifs can be deduced from its skybox. Depending on the skybox it has, you're going to see a certain set of visual motifs. So, one of the ones I find most interesting is DM18, which has no skybox at all. It's just a pitch black void. DM18 is very abstract. It's just geometry, concrete looking brownish gray stuff. It's got this pink hue to it, which I find rather likable actually, which I feel like I've seen in quite a few early demo scene architectures. Not sure what guys loved about this back in the day, but they really had something figured out. Nowadays, you just couldn't do this. You'd have to have normal maps and textures everywhere, and something would be lost. I think oftentimes we're not willing to admit how much the level of graphical detail we expect completely banishes certain art styles and art directions and even places from being represented. This level is basically kind of like a massive open temple. It's in a complete black void. There are these huge structures extending far up into the sky. The whole thing is large. It feels large. There's lots of open space, and there are lots of jump pads to get you around because of how tall everything is. It's basically purely technological. There's not really a lot going on insofar as demonic stuff goes. I like it a lot. Totally divorced from any kind of worldly stuff at all. Something you could only see in the pitch black void of space. The big square pillars are maybe the strangest thing to me. That being said, this level reminds me a lot of industrial elements in Quake 3 Arena. Even though, strictly speaking, there's nothing industrial going on, it does have that sort of disembodied, dissociated void look, with lots of concrete and other things that a lot of industrial things converge towards. I'd also like to point out how the lighting is so white everywhere. You can tell a lot, in my opinion, in Quake 3 level, not just by its skybox, but also by its primary tone of lighting. Of course, the red ones are hellish levels. You see a sort of faint yellow or colors like this in the Brimstone Abbey and Grim Dungeons levels. These sort of yellowy orangey levels, which are sort of castle-like, sort of demonic, sort of technological. Somewhere in the middle, totally classic Quake 3 Arena, whereas this is more of a marginal aesthetic. You kind of see it in some of the later DM maps. Anyways, you could go over a lot more of Quake 3 Arena. Notably, I didn't touch any of the really classic important maps like Lost World, Campgrounds, stuff like that, or many of the tourney maps. But I wanted to go over some of the basic visual motifs you see a lot. And I think these levels are pretty visually interesting, even if they're not classic Quake maps that you necessarily would think of. For example, I didn't touch Arrowwalk at all, which should maybe be a crime. These are the classic Quake 3 levels from Quake 3 itself. There's a whole extended visual language that comes from the maps made afterwards. Blood Run, ZTN, that being all these other kinds of levels you see from CPMA. Of course, Arrowwalk came right back and played a huge part in Quake 3 dueling. Stuff like that. But anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed a little bit, and let me know if you like this kind of thing, if you want to see more Quake 3 stuff. I was even considering doing a video where I go over every single Quake 3 map, which I think would be quite interesting.